What's up, y'all? It's Shuffle, and this is going to be a guide for the Foetor, also called the Foetor and the Feeder. I've heard all three of those, but it is a disease and blight-ridden region in Darkest Dungeon 2, so I will be going through what the region does, as in the themes such as blight and disease, the enemies, which ones are really dangerous, which ones are not as dangerous, how the boss works and how to beat it, as well as all the various loot that you can get between trophies and trinkets, and then at the end I'll talk about some characters that are really good to help you get through this place. There are a surprising amount of common themes in the Foetor, specifically corpse interaction. This is the region that likes to mess with dead bodies the most. What ends up happening is, if something is dead on the ground as a corpse for longer than a turn possibly, there are a few different enemies that will eat the corpse in order to get stronger. Most of the time this results in them having a super attack that comes on the following turn because they get a special token, as well as being able to heal themselves doing this. The region does have bleed, but what you need to look out for is blight. There is a lot of blight in this region, and it is something that isn't too common in the other regions, so it already takes the defensive dynamic and changes it up a bit. The next thing to watch out for in the Foetor is disease. A lot of enemies have the ability to hit you with a disease, and for anyone that's ever seen a disease in this game, most of them range from pretty bad to completely awful, and I'm going to close the game. So when you come here, just make sure that you know that you can find a hospital or maybe a Chirurgeon's table, or maybe have a resist trinket. And because of the strength of some of the diseases, I would actually recommend not going to the Foetor as your final region if you can help it. The final main thing that you'll see in this region is position disruption. This happens a bit in every single region, but in the Foetor there are quite a few amount of enemies, including the boss itself, that likes to just shove your team around and get them out of position. So that can be pretty dangerous. Let's talk about the enemies. The first one is Butcher. This is just a regular looking dude with a pretty much like slumping giraffe neck. I don't know what the heck that is, but the Butcher likes to bleed your units and pull them out of the back. The other thing that he likes to do is buff goats. So we'll talk about the goats in a sec, but between Butcher and Maid, the goat gets different buffs. In the case of the Butcher, the goat will get plus 50% bonus damage per Butcher. So if you end up fighting two Butchers with one goat, then that goat gets double damage. Overall, these are a low threat just because even though they buff the goat, their regular attacks don't hit too hard and they have a decent amount of HP, so it's kind of hard to blow through them in, one round. And your time is better spent attacking other enemies in most cases. The second point of the triangle is the Maid. The Maid is a back rank damage dealing unit for the Foetor enemies, which are also called Plague Eaters and Gentry. Pretty much all of those come up, so just be aware when you see the various trinkets and stuff for that. But Maid isn't so much a support unless there's a goat as a damage dealer. So she puts out a lot of damage with one attack, which is called Larval Slop. It hits decently hard on hit, and then it blights you for 4 damage by 3 rounds. And if it crits, it goes up to 5 or 6 if there is something like Ordainment in play. The Maids thankfully don't take too much to bring down, so if there are usually 1 or 2 in a mash that you're fighting, I would highly suggest going after them first. There's only one other thing I can think of, maybe 2, that are higher priority targets than something as dangerous as the Maid. What the Maid can do for the goat is buff its resistances and use a special move on it called Tend the Flock, which will cure the goat of random ailments and then give it repose, so it just becomes this little toy dog yapping and just being an absolute dick. There is one very special interaction that she can do with the elite goat, which is named Black Phillip, and that is being able to combo one of your units, and then Black Phillip gets access to an attack called King of All. This is a very rare situation, and I don't know if I've seen it more than once or twice myself. To complete the Holy Trinity, we have Livestock, aka the goats. They are pretty frail, so you can take them down in like 2 hits, which is really nice. They're usually a good priority target, and they're pretty annoying. They can pull your units, they can shove your units, they can do some pretty good damage, and disease you. Something else unique to the goats is they have a little food token on them, which lets other plague eaters eat the goat. I guess they just rip a chunk out of the goat and take a bite, but what ends up happening is it heals them or the party, and each goat has 2 of these. So another reason to get rid of them quickly is that other people will eat the goat as you're fighting. Thankfully, this does not trigger the corpse eating skills like bilious cannon. The other super mega high threat in the Foetor is Lady. Lady is pretty much a maid on steroids without the goat support. So Lady can hit 2 units for a 4 blight attack, as opposed to 1 which the maid can do. Also, the Lady is able to eat bodies and get access to a super move that hits the entire team, and she's just generally annoying with her other moves that can move your party around and disrupt positioning. Thankfully, she isn't super tanky, so this is the only unit I would suggest going after super hard, even harder than the goat sometimes, because the goat is not nearly as annoying as a Lady can be. Now for the big guys, we're going to talk about the size 2 enemies. These are the ones that take up bigger spaces on the enemy side of the field. The first is Dinner Cart. And Dinner Cart likes to vomit up corpses and eat them so it can give itself its own super attack trigger by eating those bodies. Otherwise, it's pretty tanky, it can hit kind of hard, and it's really hard to kill because it heals so much off eating those bodies that most of the time I save these for last. The super move that comes out of Dinner Cart is one that targets your backline, hits both of them, and gives them blights. Final size 2 is Lord. I'm assuming this is the husband of the Lady, but the Lord is a huge dude that will eat corpses, buff its friends, and slap you to the back of the line. It also has an attack that hits your entire party and can give them Hemic Rot, which is a disease that gives you weak tokens. If the Lord is able to eat a corpse, he gets access to a cannon attack where he hits 1 target pretty hard, blights them, and stuns them. So this is something you want to avoid if you can. Unlike Lady, and more similar to Dinner Cart, the Lord is hard to burst down in any reasonable time frame. You would need some kind of heavy hitter, like a single target heavy hitter, like Hellion, Leper, Bounty Hunter, sometimes a Cultist. There are a few characters that can do it, but most of the time, it's going to take 4, maybe 5 hits to get through Lord, and it's better to just leave him for the end. He's really annoying, but he's not super dangerous. Now we're going to talk about the elite enemies from the Foetor. The first is Black Phillip, which is a very cool looking goat, and the main difference between him and the regular goats is that Black Phillip gets 2 actions per round instead of 1. What happens is that Black Phillip can put out a quick amount of damage that you may not be ready for, and if he's coming with his friends that like to buff him, just like the regular goats, then he can really dismantle your party fairly quickly. He pretty much operates the same as a regular goat, he just has that special attack that's incredibly rare, and so much like the regular goat, it's usually good to get rid of him first before anything else. The final elite and enemy to talk about is Tono the Carver. Tono is an elite version of the Butcher. Much like other elites which have boosted abilities and some other mechanics, Tono has the ability to give every goat that's with him plus 100% damage instead of 50, so he counts as 2 Butchers for the buff, which means those goats can get up to 150, and I've heard even tales of 200% bonus damage if it's Tono, 2 Butchers, and 1 Goat, which is honestly frightening. Tono's no slouch by himself either. He hits pretty hard, he can move your units around, and I've actually had him pretty much solo my team in one of my runs. It doesn't help that he has the ability to put vulnerable tokens on yourself, so you take bonus damage, and then he can give himself strength tokens to boost his damage further, and he has access to bleed, so all he needs to do is hit 1 massive crit with a bleed on you, and that could kill a unit before you can do anything. Now we're going to talk about the boss of the Foetor, Harvest Child, aka Boss Baby, and currently this is probably my favorite Lair Boss that exists. The reason I like it is because the mechanics are pretty fun overall, but also it's the most fair boss fight that's been in the game. Out of every single Lair Boss that has been introduced, all 4 of them, and even some of the mini bosses, Harvest Child has been changed the least, meaning that when it was initially put in the game, it was already pretty balanced. You got like 1 or 2 tweaks halfway through just to update his mechanics slightly, but no overhauls, no damage numbers, nothing like that. So I think it's the best balanced Lair Boss currently. There are 2 things to watch out for when you're fighting Harvest Child. The main mechanics are hunger, which come from the 2 piles of meat that are on the field with him, and then the position of Harvest Child himself, because that is showing you what attack he's going to use next. The first main mechanic, hunger, is really annoying and pretty prone to RNG, so depending on how unlucky you get with speed rolls and resist, he might just lock down your front line and end the run. The hunger debuff is a blue token with a knife and fork, and it comes from the meat piles. The smaller of the 2 piles we call the small meat or little meat, and that one specifically always targets your back line. It'll hit the 2 people in the back of the party every single time it gets a turn. What it tries to do is a little bit of damage, it'll blind your back line, and then it'll finally give you a chance of receiving a hunger token. The other meat, which we call the big meat or the cleaver meat, the one with the actual cleaver sticking out of it, this one is way more dangerous. The one that hits the back line usually can be ignored. The one that hits the front line is the one that can end your fight. The reason for this is that the big meat targets your front line, and besides giving you a hunger token, what it ends up doing is putting vulnerable on your 2 frontline characters, meaning that the moment Harvest Child gets up to the front to do a big attack, it can put out a ton of damage. What does hunger actually do? So hunger is the main mechanic of the fight, and it's a negative token. It's not an orange token, which is worth noting because you have ways to get rid of it, unlike most orange tokens, which usually come with bosses. When a hero has hunger, they move forward 1 space at the start of their turn, unless they're immobilized or someone in front of them in rank 1, for instance, is immobilized as well, because what they're trying to do is get to the very, very front of the party, so as close to the meat and the boss as possible. And if they make it there with a hunger token, they will skip their entire turn. You'll be forced to take a bite out of one of the meats, and in return, you get rid of the hunger token, but you lower your own max HP for the duration of the fights. One of the updates that Harvest Child got was that when you trigger hunger, you end up lowering your affinity with your teammates, so that's something new. One may think that lowering your HP every time you have to eat the meat is actually the worst part of this whole situation, and actually it's not. It's the fact that you just skip your entire turn to do this, and the reason the cleaver meat is so dangerous is because once it starts locking down your front line with hunger, they will constantly just trade positions, skip turns, and sometimes you can go a couple rounds without your front line getting to do anything. And then when your back line can't hit anything because they're blind, that's when the boss starts to kill you. Thankfully, hunger has quite a few different counters. The first one is to use something that gets rid of negative tokens, like holy water, which will cleanse every single negative token off a person, including combo, which is very nice. Another isn't as common, and that is Plague Doctor's Indiscriminate Science ability. This is a heal that, if you're low enough to get healed by it, it also removes all of the tokens off of you to get bonus healing. The benefit of this is that that ability has infinite uses per fight, and it has the ability also to remove the hunger token and even the vulnerable token if it happens to be there. This goes a long way in keeping your front line healthy, and it's a good thing to do with Plague Doctor if she's stacked with blinds, so at least she doesn't, swing and miss on her turn. The other way to deal with hunger is to simply not let the unit get up to rank 1. This is easily done by having someone like Leper or Hellion or Man-at-Arms who have the ability to immobilize themselves in the front. And so if someone's up there immobilized, even though you have the hunger token, they can't get into that spot because you're already there, so they can't get up to the front, and eat. So as long as your immobilized tank is able to keep the hunger off themselves or not get hunger at a really bad time, you can keep everyone else out of the front, and that really makes the fight easier. Another way to do this, which might be a little trickier for newer players because they often just don't feel comfortable with dance teams, is to make a dance team or have some kind of movement abilities. So if you have the ability to push and pull your own units with stuff like lunge, duelist advance, and get in front of each other, then you don't have to worry about some getting into rank 1 because you're always pushing past them when it's coming up for their turn. In a pinch though, if you don't want to use any of the dancing abilities and you don't have immobilize, you can simply move the unit in front of them. The little button with the 2 arrows that show that you can change positioning is really helpful here. So if you're able to even go 1 space forward, you can move in front of someone when they're about to have their hunger turn and then push them back, and then they'll go forward in front of you the next turn. This only doesn't work if you're going into rank 1 because they're still going to push past you from 2, go into 1, and then eat. Everywhere else though, 3, 2, whatever, like all of those are perfectly fine and viable to move. Just make sure you're still putting damage into the boss. Dealing with the meat and mitigating all of that variance is the best way to win this fight. So not only can you immobilize yourself, move in front of each other, or dodge whatever happens, you can actually just make it so the meat doesn't get the attack off at all. Easiest way to do this is something like smoke bombs, because they'll put 2 blind tokens on the meat and that will have it potentially miss, and that's very beneficial for you. Another thing you can do is stun the meat. This is pretty hard to do with a lot of characters because most stuns in the game require you to set a combo token on the enemy and then use a different unit to hit it and trigger the stun. That's a bit difficult to do consistently. So instead of that, we're looking at combat items that have the ability to stun. The easiest source of stun on a combat item is Pyrotechnic Dazzler. This has a chance to do random effects, but stun is one of them. And if the stun goes off, or even like the minus speed debuff, that's really helpful when you're fighting the meat. There is another item that can do this as well. It's called the Thunderclap Grenade. It hits the entire enemy party. It shuffles their position, and then it has a small chance of stunning a target. This one is not advised unless you're really desperate, because not only is the stun inconsistent, you might push Harvest Child up to the front, and that's really dangerous for you. And then as a final reminder, Holy Water is the absolute easiest way to get the hunger token off of you. The combat item, you can take 2 of them into the fight, and it does a pretty good job. Spent a lot of time talking about meat being tempting and steamy and getting you to bite it, but we have a boss to deal with. So Harvest Child doesn't just sit there and watch all this happen. So what ends up happening with Harvest Child is, if you play Darkest Dungeon 1, the fight is very reminiscent of The Flesh, where that was a boss that had 4 different parts. The back ones, most of the time, would hit you with Blight, and the front would hit you with Bleed, and there'd be like a random stun. Harvest Child actually operates very similar to that. So when Harvest Child's in the back or the middle, he can hit you with a Blight attack, or a stress attack. The stress one is probably the easiest thing to deal with, so you want to see that the most. And if the fight design didn't give it away, when Harvest Child gets up to the front, it uses an attack called Maws of Life. This is literally the same move that the Flesh used in the first game, and this can hit both of your frontline people. It does some pretty good damage, and it applies a bleed. This is how Harvest Child picks up kills. Your front line gets locked down because of the meat. They get vulnerable tokens from that attack, and then Harvest Child scoots up there and then crits your ass for like 16. You're bleeding, and eventually you're going to be dying. The reason I like this fight so much, though, is that there's a ton of counterplay. You know, it took several minutes to explain all of the different abilities and items that can deal with the meat and hunger, and there's a few different tricks you can use to deal with Harvest Child as well to stop him from just killing your front line. The first is movement. So as you notice, Harvest Child will use either Sapid Drippings, which is the Blight attack, or Tantalizing Tidbit, which is the stress attack, and both of those move it forward 1 space. Once it gets to the front and uses Maws, it goes all the way back in the party. There are a couple ways to mitigate this, because if you're able to stop Maws of Life from going off, you drastically lower the damage in this fight. The first is pulling meat past Harvest Child. If it starts moving up front, you can use something like Demon's Pull or a Bounty Hunter ability if you have them unlocked, and you'll be able to pull the meat past Harvest Child back up into the front and reset his attack pattern. If you're able to immobilize whatever meat is in rank 1, much like how you do to your own party, since you can prevent the hunger that way, you can prevent Harvest Child from getting into rank 1 and using Maws of Life. There are a couple abilities that do this pretty well, like Bash with Leper is a really good one for this, but there's also an item called Fisherman's Net, and that applies 2 immobilized tokens when you throw it. There are also a few knockbacks in the game, so if you want to do that instead, maybe you get your turn first with Highwayman, you hit him with point blank shot, shove him back a space, There are a lot of ways to rearrange the enemy team. The Thunderclap grenades that I mentioned before that shuffle the team, not really good when Harvest Child's in the back, pretty good when Harvest Child's in the front because you might actually push him out of there so you don't take damage. It may seem like a lot when dealing with Harvest Child, trying to juggle the meats and the debuffs and the positioning, and it might take a few tries to get it down, but it's pretty smooth once you understand the pattern of the fight. So just Harvest Child moves up a couple times, bites you, moves back. The meat always target the same people, so as long as you have some way to deal with it, usually you're okay. Even though this fight is very predictable because of the hunger procs and resistances and random speed rolls, you might use the same team 2 different times and have 2 different results in this fight just because of the variance. If you're able to successfully beat Harvest Child, you get access to the trophies and some trinkets. The trophies from Harvest Child are Harvest Bounty, which gives you 25 extra inventory slots. Pretty good overall. The earlier you get this, the better, because you don't have a lot of items at the start, you have a ton of items at the middle of the game, and then when you get to the mountain, you start using all of them, so you have nothing left. So you can get this in region 1 or 2. 1's pretty dangerous, but if you're able to get it early, it gives you a lot of value. The second trophy is Bumper Crop. What this does is lowers your death blow resist, which is abbreviated as DBR, or in the game it's DTH. And this is your percentage chance to not die when you are at 0 HP, aka death's door. You may be thinking, why do I want to run a trophy that lowers my chance of survival? And the answer is that the other side of the trophy is a pretty solid upside. You get bonus healing. Because of this, since you have bonus healing, all of your heals are way stronger. You're able to stay farther away from death's door more consistently. So it's only a real issue if something, gets a couple crits on you, or if you have a meltdown at 10 stress, because those put you to low HP. You can avoid both of those situations. This trophy is pretty good. The final one is Rancid Feast. This is a pretty damage-centric trophy, so if you're lacking on damage and you see it, it might help you. What it does is every time an enemy attacks you, the trophy tries to put a 1 damage over 3 round blight onto them for doing it. This isn't super great in most regular fights, although it does help because any bonus damage that you don't have to actually do is always nice to have. But when you're fighting bosses, mountain bosses, and stuff like that, it actually gets a lot better because those will have either AoE attacks or multiple actions, so they're always proccing it on themselves. The downside is kind of terrifying, and that is when you get hit, you have a chance of getting blighted yourself. It's a lower chance, it's a 1 in 3 instead of guaranteed, but historically in this game, anything that can do extra damage to you when you're not planning for it can be really dangerous and oftentimes get someone killed. It's no different with Rancid Feast. As cool and good as it can be, if you end up getting, again, just like a massive crit that comes your way, or a Vuln token or what have you, take a bunch of damage, get hit to death's door, enemy doesn't have a damage over time attack, but guess what? Now you have a blight, and your turn might come up and someone just drops dead. It's not a common scenario. I'm just trying to tell you the extremes that you might find yourself in if stuff goes awry. All 3 trophies are pretty solid, just really depends what you're trying to do with your team, and it's okay to kick one if you have access to another trophy if you don't want one of these. It's time to talk about trinkets, so the stuff you can get out of the Foetor that's exclusive to it. The first one are kitchen knives. This is a blight-centric trinket. If an enemy is blighted or if you resist blight, cool stuff happens, like extra damage, self-heal, and even an extra turn if you can resist a blight. The issue with the kitchen knives is that you're not always running a blight team, and blight isn't incredibly common outside of the Foetor. unless you go to something like the sluice. So if you have these, oftentimes you might not see the value in them unless you go back to the Foetor and do it a second time, which is valid. If someone has access to high crits, either just a high crit percentage or crit tokens, this trophy can just turn into something that heals them periodically, which is pretty good for early game. The next indelible trinket is Ghastly Gruel. This thing is pretty solid. It just has a chance to heal everyone each turn, and depending where you're at, if you're in the front, you get healed for more. If you're in the back, you heal other people more. And just by the random nature of being able to heal the team, you can actually save people from time to time. So this is a pretty solid trinket that I'd recommend using. The third trinket to talk about is Curing Cuppa. This is a teapot that gives you bonus blight on hits. As for the other part of resisting blight at high HP, that is very, very niche and honestly not something to plan around. So you're really just using this for the blight on hit. Galvanizing Goblet is the, I guess, purified version of the Tempting Goblet from the first game because they look similar, and that's pretty cool. But it acts the same as Cuppa, where it's good for a blight hero, and the resist that it has is cool when it happens, but otherwise niche. Moving into the blue tier trinkets, we have Brilliant Brew, which is surprisingly better than Goblet in terms of blight damage, because in like 99% of cases, blight duration is better than blight damage per round, because it's usually a much better increase. Something that's nice as a trinket to aid your blade heroes that are not named Alchemist Plague Doctor is the Corrupting Cleaver. This gives your units a higher chance to apply blight. So if you're not running Alchemist Plague Doctor, or if it gets reworked in the future and doesn't operate the same way it does, disregard this message. But if you have that type of Plague Doctor, or you have Flagellant, or you have Grave Robber, characters that like to use blight attacks, then this is pretty good for helping them get through enemy resistances. Next is Hag's Horde. This is really just better than nothing, but this is something I pretty much toss after I start filling out the rest of my trinket slots. It's not amazing. Poison Ring, however, is pretty cool. It's like a combination of the Corrupting Cleaver and the Goblet, but it has extra steps in needing to spend your combat item slot with a Noxious item and not using it in order to get the bonuses. And then unlike those other two trinkets, it does have a noticeable downside if something goes wrong. The final trinket I am surprised is not a yellow tier trinket. That is Hint of Home. This thing is super good. So it's really, really good on your tanks because they get hit a lot. And it's not something that heals you for 2 life. It's actually the restoration symbol. So it heals you for 2 life every action you take for 3 turns. So it can heal up to 6 life. If you get lucky enough and it keeps proccing on your tanks, guess what? They're going to be healing a fair bit of HP. So this thing is usually good to keep around. Even if you start getting towards the end of the run and you might find better stuff, there usually is a target that can run this. To wrap up the video, we're going to talk about the best heroes to bring to the Foetor. As always, any character can work. You just have to be a little more creative with some of them or put in more work. But these are the ones I think are pretty good with like minimal effort. First is Plague Doctor. She can clear corpses with Magnesium Rain. She can deal with the negative tokens with Indiscriminate Science. She can cure damage over time with Battlefield Medicine. And she has Ounce of Prevention, which blocks 3 out of the 4 things that are listed on it. So the only thing that doesn't show up in the Foetor is Burn, but Bleed, Blight, and Disease all show up, and Ounce of Prevention can hopefully mitigate some of those. I wouldn't use it unmastered though. Like the 15% bonus isn't quite good enough to justify. So if you do use it, make sure that Ounce of Prevention is something you want to use, and then you put your point into it. Plague Doctor is also able to make good use of the trinkets that come out of the region. So all the blight-centric stuff is pretty good on her. And if you're worried about sticking blights, guess what? She has Incision, which is a bleed move, and that does much better. So it is never bad to take her to this region. The next character to talk about is Occultist. Occultist has a really good combination of Corpse Clear with Demon's Pull, and he can do some solid range damage between Artillery and Burning Stars if you have that unlocked. Some of the enemies in the Foetor also don't like being moved, so if you can get them out of position, usually good things happen. So between his ability to get rid of corpses, move people, set up his teammates, and provide emergency healing, Occultist does surprisingly well in the Foetor. He just doesn't make a good use of the Trinkets. A final mention is that if you have Malediction unlocked for Occultist, he can really melt Harvest Child by throwing that at him. So Malediction is a move where every time the target takes damage, they have a random chance of getting Bleed, Blight, or Burn. And it feeds back off itself, so it can sit there and just ramp itself up over a couple turns, and Harvest Child has 2 actions per turn, so it starts to spiral out of control pretty quickly. The difficulty is getting it off before something bad happens like Blind or Hunger. Next up is the King. Leper is actually really good in this region, especially if you run his Tempest Path where he gets a bonus to debuff resist. It makes him a very solid tank up front. There are a couple other benefits to Leper. The first is he has a corpse clear. This is called Purge. And if he's in the very front of the party, he can remove corpses whenever the heck he wants. The other thing that's good about him is that he has survivability. He has a pretty good defensive kit between Intimidate and Withstand. He also has a very strong self-heal in Solemnity. The final thing that makes Leper super good, even though you have to have his shrines unlocked to use this, is his attack called Bash. Bash pulls weight doing 2 different things. The first is it immobilizes Leper. So if you're fighting Harvest Child, for instance, that locks the rest of your party from getting up front. The other is Bash immobilizes the target that it hits. So before I was talking about that you can immobilize the meat up front and keep Harvest Child out of there. Well, guess what? Leper can do that every single turn and keep the boss out of the front for the entire fight. Again, barring some disaster like a Hunger token. The final character I'll talk about is Grave Robber, my personal favorite in the entire series, but she's pretty good in the Foetor as well. She can make use of the Blight Trinkets, which is a positive. She also has really good movement options, so if your party's getting pushed and pulled around by the various enemies, she can always kind of help fix it by moving back and forth. And she has the ability to deal with corpses. She has an ability called Dead of Night where she destroys a corpse and gets a little bit of healing, but more importantly, gets it off the field. She can only use it 3 times a battle, but honestly, that's usually enough. I have never been in a situation where I've needed more than 3, so I think she's really good at dealing with the corpse situation. The final thing that's really nice about her is that in terms of damage, she has a lot of reach, is what we call it, where you can hit multiple spots from multiple spots. So Grave Robber is able to hit the front, hit the back. He can do it pretty easily from the mid ranks, decently well from the front, decently from the back, so she doesn't usually have trouble hitting targets. I mentioned these 4 and I did put them in the background footage, but you don't need to run this exact team. Usually 1 or 2 of these characters, if the Foetor gives you trouble, is good enough to help deal with most of it. And this also isn't to say that other characters don't work here as well. I just picked these because I feel that they're the easiest to use in terms of value and they have a very strong impact. Alright y'all, that's going to do it for the video. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts, concerns, questions, leave them down below in the comments section. And if you want to support the channel or join the community and see all the other cool stuff that I have to offer, check out the description box below with things like Discord, Patreon, Twitter, which X, who cares, and Twitch. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.